Okay, we start. The city block is, as I said to George last night, it's not a hegemonic block, luckily. So,
okay, I confess, I'm City University Ivor Gaber. Thank you. It was a really interesting, stimulating, eccentric talk. I just wondered, given what you said about public subsidy and how important it is to democracy, of which I and I'm sure everybody in this room 100% agree, what your view of the BBC is specifically, because on the one hand, anybody who looks at the BBC website, news website, will see, I think, a public good in all its way. On the other hand, there are many critics of the BBC here who would argue that it reflects the narrow official source view that you described. I just wonder if you see within the BBC either a model of the way to go or a warning of the dangers.
Can you pass the mic straight over, Ivor, to George next door, since we've got a clustering strategically contrived, I'm sure.
This is one question and one observation, Robert. You obviously devoted yourself largely to diagnosis rather than to prescription, but at the end you talked a little bit about an equivalent of the program you have in the States for teachers and so on. And specifically on prescription, I'd like to ask, if you want to support journalism publicly, how do you determine who deserves the support? My observation is that you had a certain amount of fun talking about people who think that great journalism is going to be done by grassroots amateurs and so on and so on. It seems to me implicit in what you yourself are arguing is that if change is going to happen, a certain amount of change is going to involve rebuilding, and a certain amount of rebuilding involves rebuilding from a low level down in the grassroots, not just supporting existing institutions and carrying them across. I take it you agree, but I just wanted to check that you do.
Okay, and can we take the hands up over there? There's Angela and Steve.
Angela Phillips from Goldsmiths, and I'm asking a quite similar but more specific question. I mean, I was delighted, I think, to hear you, a real antidote to what we heard yesterday. But I think we need to start talking about specifics. I mean, if we're talking about the internet, we're no longer talking about subsidizing the delivery of news. We're no longer talking about subsidizing the printing process. We're now down to the kind of core of it, which is how do you find an equitable way of subsidizing people's jobs and a way which wouldn't become immediately hostage to different political processes. I mean, how would one do it, and have you been thinking about specifics?
Okay, can we pass the mic on to the...
Igor Godler, Ben-Gurion University, Israel. You've talked about the irony that is the fact that America seems to have a rich history of publicly subsidized media, and yet it's been forgotten, and now it's anathema to in political discourse and in public discourse. And I wanted to know whether you're not also omitting simultaneously the anti-democratic and the elitist statements that were made by James Madison as well as Walter Lippmann himself. I believe it was James Madison who said that we need to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, and Walter Lippmann who called the general population a bewildered herd. And even Aristotle himself, I believe, was quite elitist in his approach, and he sort of thought about the best way to get the public to acquiesce, and he talked about distributive justice as being the optimal solution.
Okay, thanks. Can we take the mic? We'll take questions for a couple more minutes or so, as long as the hands pop up.
Thanks very much. Steve Shivers, I just wanted to pick up on, I think, one of the most interesting parts of your talk, the idea of what's happening in business journalism, because I think that much of our debate often is about either covering foreign affairs or covering politics. I found it very refreshing to look at also the coverage of business, and I think the particular and perhaps stronger difficulties in business in being captured by PR, being captured by the official version of events, and I think that is probably some ways stronger or more difficult because of the nature of sources you have and so forth. But I'm interested in your take, in a sense, on how this would play out comparatively. For example, in a way, the investigative tradition in the U.S. started with business investigations, Ida Tarbell, Leakage Steffens in the Progressive Era. And what were the conditions that made that possible then that don't make it possible now? And also whether, there's a particular constellation, of economic and political power in the U.S. that makes this a bigger problem in the U.S. than other countries. How does this look in comparative perspective?
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, are we done? Right.
I think we got a.
You've got quite a lot there. BBC,
I'm glad you're all here for the
tour
next hour
there.
of my talk.
Yeah, well, I should get very agitated in about 10 minutes. Okay.
No, don't worry. I'll do my best. Well, let's start at the top with the question regarding the BBC and critics of it, of whom I see a little bit of BBC America, and I go to the website periodically, but I don't present myself as an expert on the BBC by any stretch. But I do read the criticism of it. I know John Pilger, for example, is blistering in his criticism of it, and I see Pilger's work periodically, and I know he's not the only one. I think that in some sense, the BBC is a much better resourced version of our NPR in that regard, which is our NPR, which is by far our best radio journalism, which is like being the tallest mountain in Denmark, because we have no radio journalism except for NPR. But our radio journalism is good. It's good in the sense that it avoids the idiocy of commercial journalism. There's not going to be stories on how big Kim Kardashian's butt is, or some celebrity nonsense, or just complete silliness. But unfortunately, they do fall prey to the same problems of professional journalism on foreign policy and economic policy. They're still, when they do serious journalism, they tend to rely far too much on official sources, the official range of debate. And I think that's the point you were making about the BBC, that it too, even being independent, even though it's not a commercial undertaking or having advertising, the code of journalism it has adopted, which grew up in the commercial era, is one that basically allows people in power far too much control over what's being talked about and what isn't, and the tenor of it. Is that a fair assessment? I just want to make sure.
That's a fair answer.
Okay, I just want to. Now I'll give you my answer. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. I think the solution to that is, in the United States at least, and in the United States we have the same problem. The solution is you have to have more than one type of nonprofit, non-commercial broadcasting, one type of system. You need plurality, not monopoly. And the BBC's issue would be less of an issue if there was a community system. Let's talk about America, because I don't want to get into Britain. But if we have a wave of community stations that are locally accountable, unconnected to NPR doing radio, that have the resources to cover their communities, that have a different approach to journalism, maybe somewhat closer to the one I described that Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald do, that's more critical people in authority, more the Eye of Stone tradition, then that can give the credence to sort of blast open the journalism and create space. And then maybe the professional people will see there's room out there to do more critical work. And that's, to me, a way to solve the problems through more quality journalism and diverse newsrooms that are funded rather than trying to go in and tell them how to do it. I'm not a big fan of censorship under any circumstances. And if you read my work, you'll see that I just don't think good things happen. I think you want to set up independent structures and let them work on their own and just try to set up the best possible structures to get the best outcome. And I'll talk about the internet stuff, and I'll give you what that means when we get to specifics when I get to that point. But basically, I think we need multiple institutions, types of institutions that are well-funded. We can't just have one type of structure and assume that's good. And that's the best way out of the BBC logjam. I spent a lot of time in my books actually looking at prescriptions. And I was going to do more prescription stuff until I heard yesterday morning's talk. And I thought I needed to sort of get back to some basics before I went on. In America, fortunately, the discussion has moved, is moving. I won't say has moved. Is moving much closer to an understanding that doing what we're doing now is getting us nowhere. And we really do have to start having this conversation, especially at places like journalism schools and journalism departments. People who are paying attention see that what's happening isn't working at all. We have to do something. And in the book, we have a lot of discussions of specifics. I don't go too far on that simply because I think a lot of this, we just have to get people talking about it and investigating it. I don't think I can come up with a ready-made solution. There's stuff we can learn internationally that can be done. But as far as the internet, one of my favorite proposals, and it's in the book, was developed by an economist in America who The Guardian publishes a lot, at least they used to, named Dean Baker, and a very smart guy. And Dean came up with an idea actually in the 90s, to his credit. And he hasn't really done much with it since then, but I've sort of taken it over, but I give him credit for the idea, which is that the way to deal with journalism in the digital era in a democratic society, to have a public subsidy that doesn't allow for the government to have any control over the content, is to give everyone a voucher that they can give to any news medium of their choice using public money. They can direct $200 to any news medium of their choice. And the only condition would be that it would have to meet current IRS criteria to be nonprofit. And the IRS actually has very strong criteria for determining who's nonprofit, because they have to do that for their tax codes. And so everyone knows what that stands for. It's not a controversial thing. And the other condition would be that anyone who qualifies would have to put everything they do instantly in the public domain. Nothing's protected by copyright, so there's no subsidy going to create private public domain, privatized information. And the reason why that's important is journalism is the one type of news media, one type of media content that doesn't really need copyright. So it's not really that important, whereas all other types desperately need it. So it's going to be less likely someone's going to try to produce music or make a movie using those subsidies if whatever they produce automatically goes into the public domain and anyone can produce it and distribute it for free. And so that criteria in itself would go a long way towards eliminating scam artists and not requiring, therefore, any governance or anyone monitoring it too closely. But the principle, if you get past that, would work like this. If everyone in America had a $200 voucher where they could distribute $200 of federal money to any qualifying news media of their choice, that would mean if you live in a city where the local newspaper isn't especially good, or you're not happy with it, or the local newsrooms, if 1,000 people in your city donate their $200, that's 1,000 people, that's $200,000. Well, you can hire, several reporters to cover your area then. And if they don't do a good job, someone else can start a year later. It would open competition. It would keep it highly competitive. And what would happen, though, we know from record, is it's not as chaotic as it seems. Invariably, what would happen is that a handful would emerge and dominate and get a lot of support, and then some would come along slowly. It would crystallize very quickly within a few years. But it would allow there to be a massive public subsidy with no government control over who gets the money. You get to pick who gets it. And so that's the sort of policy. I'm not saying that's the solution, but that's the way we have to be thinking. Because the digital era makes a mockery of the traditional commercial business model. We shouldn't be trying to set up barbed wire and charge people to get in. Pay people in advance, produce it, and let everyone in for free. Make it accessible to everyone at all times. And that's what this model would do. I always thought it was a brilliant idea. I'm sure we could come up with others. Dean Baker did that over drinks in an hour in Washington, D.C. Imagine if we had all the smart people in this world sitting around trying to think about it for a month or two. Probably come up with 100 plans just as good as that. But that's the direction we need to be thinking creatively to solve a problem and eliminate our very strong concerns about censorship and lack of competition. James Madison, Walter Lippmann, Aristotle, yeah. I'll give that lecture now if you want. They were not Democrats. I think what you can say about James Madison, though, and Lippmann, too, they were liberals in the elitist sense, that they didn't mind mass participation if people were educated up to agree with them. And you could cynically look at it. They wanted them educated up so they would buy into what they're saying. Or you could say they were genuine liberals. If they were educated, they'd live with the consequences of whatever those people might want. I'm not going to put words in Madison's mouth. But they were on the continuum from Paine and Franklin at one end to John Jay and John Adams at the other end, who thought the classic view, those who own the country ought to govern it. And they were sort of in between there. But they were liberals in the sense that they weren't opposed to universal suffrage on the condition people were well educated. And there was a good press system. And frankly, right now, I'll take that position. I'm going to throw one back in the water. Give me great universal education and a great press system. And if someone wants to say that's Aristotle's program, I'll ride with it. I'm not going to get picky on that one. Investigative journalism and business journalism. Investigative journalism is something that's disappearing in the United States. What passes for investigative journalism of business and everything else in the United States is today, they still have an investigative breaking story. It's usually when someone in power wants to leak something about someone else and a journalist reports it and calls it an investigation. That's what passes for investigative journalism in America. It's very rarely now, unfortunately, that a team of reporters gets 3 or 6 months to go out and really go after something that no one in power wants to talk about, do the hard digging, do the follow-up, do the fact-checking, and break a major story. That's a be-all, end-all of great investigative journalism. And it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. I mean, why would any company want to spend that sort of money? You can't afford that. Just doesn't, business-wise, it doesn't make any sense. And the people who own our news media, including our public media, aren't really very excited about getting and doing investigative research on people in power. It's just going to piss them off. It's the last thing you want to do. So it's sort of a double whammy on that in our society. And so it's a real crisis. I mean, that's one of the things we have to get back to. We have to have a fourth estate that can monitor how people in power operate, both commercially and in the public sector, and especially as they interact, which is really where, in modern capitalism in the United States and most places in the world, that's the central political issue of our times, the interaction of corporate power, of wealth, and governance. That's where the real decisions are made, and that's where people have to participate, or else your democracy is paper thin, if existent at all. So I guess I did it. 11:15.
You've certainly done it. Thank you very much. You've done it with style.